Today, I'd like to talk about how we express conversation or communication in TBTA. So there are a number of verbs or events that express communication. The most generic one is speak A. Speak B is like to speak a language, so that's different from saying that someone's saying words. So speak A is the generic word for communicating. If you put the mouse over the fourth column, you see the possible arguments. The agent is mandatory, and then there are optional patient, source, destination, instrument, and beneficiary. So it would be very unusual to have all of those optional arguments in one sentence, but it is possible, as I'll show in a moment. I mentioned earlier that if you get good at it, you can get a lot of information from the letters in the fourth column, labeled theta grids at the top. Next to speak A, we see that there's a capital A, where the mouse is pointing right now. And that means that the fact that it's a capital letter means that it's a mandatory argument. So the agent is mandatory. The second one has possibly a capital or lowercase b as in Bravo. That's the place for the patient argument, which is the most common argument other than the agent. This one's lowercase, so that means the patient argument is optional. And then there are four other lowercase letters, and that means there are four other possible optional arguments. And those correspond to source, destination, instrument, and beneficiary. Okay, so now for the rest of this tutorial, I'm going to switch to a Word document that shows some examples. So for Speak A, all you have to have is the agent. So you could say, Jesus spoke. Now in these examples, I'm going to use the black text for mandatory parts of the sentence, and the red items will be optional. So here's the most general way with all the optional arguments you could use speak. Jesus spoke about God for the people, from Jesus' house, to the people, with the language of the people. So about God would be the optional patient. That's what he's speaking about. For the people would be the beneficiary. From Jesus' house would be the source. To the people would be the destination, and with the language of the people would be the instrument. Like I said, that would be unusual to have all those arguments together. So now let's talk about some other words that can be used to express communication. Tell A, here's an example. Jesus told people with God's authority, in brackets, that Jesus will return. So the mandatory parts are Jesus told people that Jesus will return. So people is the destination, and that Jesus will return is the patient proposition. With God's authority would be an instrument argument. Okay, so the basic idea of that is that you're telling someone a proposition, but it's indirect. It's not a quote. This is an indirect speech that's telling you what's said. Tell B also has indirect speech. Paul told people to worship Jesus. Now, unfortunately, the analyzer gets it wrong no matter how I input this. So this is something that really ought to be fixed. As Todd may tell you someday, he hasn't put as much effort on fixing up the analyzer because ultimately it's the generator, the part that generates into new languages that we want lots of people to be using. So unfortunately, no matter how I type this sentence, it doesn't come out right when the analyzer does the analysis. So I think probably it would be best to type it, Paul told people to worship Jesus, ultimately, if the analyzer could be fixed. But for right now, it works a little bit better if you write it this way. Paul told people, left bracket, people to worship Jesus. Unfortunately, it's going to get the wrong sense of tell, so you're going to have to correct that. So this is when you're telling someone to do something. That's tell B. Okay, tell C is to tell someone about something. Jesus told people about God with stories. So it has an optional instrument argument. The told people would be the destination, the people you're telling to, and about God would be the patient. It's what the telling is about. Okay, tell D. Instead of telling about something, this is to tell people something. So in this case, Jesus told people God's messages. So that could be messages, words, something like that, a story. So God's messages would be the optional patient argument. There's a mandatory destination, told people. And the with the God's authority would be the instrument argument. Now we come to probably what's the most common way to express speech, and that's with say. Say A is for direct speech. Jesus said to the people, an optional destination argument, left bracket, open quote, you people paren, imperative in parentheses, IMP, this indicates that imperative is a command, it's telling people to do something, love God. Close quote, right bracket, period. Now, to remember the structure of the order of the items in the structure, it's best to remember this single sentence form. Jesus is telling the people, and you put what he told people in the left brackets. The open quotes and close quote go inside the brackets, and the period always goes at the end of the sentence. So that tells you the order. I actually don't like this convention. I think it would have been better to put the open quote outside of the square brackets, because if you have multiple sentences, the close quote is going to go outside of everything. But for right now, this is the way it is in this first sentence and the second sentence. The left bracket comes first and then the open quote. So here's an example with multiple sentences. Jesus said to the people, left bracket, open quote, you people paren, imperative paren, love God, right bracket, period, and you love the people who are near you. So this is a way of expressing neighbors, you can see. And as I said, the close quote will go after the last sentence that's a quote, but the start of it is just like for a single sentence, left bracket, open quote, and then you always have the close quote for that first sentence. So it's a little bit non-intuitive structure. This is the way we have to do it right now. Okay, say B is to say things, say words, say stories. People said false things to the religious leaders. So false things would be the patient, and there's an optional destination argument. Say C, this is for indirect speech. We had an example of that with tell. John said, left bracket, that John loved God, right bracket. Okay, so it's putting what's said, but indirectly, it's not a quote, in as a proposition. This would be the patient proposition in the brackets. The next three forms of say are specialized for laws or books. Say D has two different forms. Probably this should be broken up into two separate sentences, but two different senses for say. But right now it's one, and there's an optional patient argument. The law says things, or an optional patient proposition. The law says that people should obey the law. So I can't think of an example where you'd have both of these arguments at the same time, so I think you're going to have one or the other. And this is used for a law or a command. Say E is for a book, and it's like direct speech. So it's like say A, but it's for a book, something that's written. God's book says, comma, left bracket, open quote, you people, paren, imperative paren, love God. Close quote, right bracket, period. So it's just like say A for direct speech, but it's a book saying something. Say F is also for direct speech. It's exactly the same as say E, but it's for a law or a command. Jesus' law says, love God. So it has the same structure for direct speech. Then we come to forms of speech involving questions. Ask A is Jesus asked the religious leaders a question. The religious leaders would be the destination, that's optional, and he asked a question would be a patient argument. Ask B is to ask for something. The man asked Peter for money. So Peter would be the mandatory destination, and money would be the patient argument. Ask C is asking someone to do something. Jesus asked those people, left bracket, those people to eat, right bracket. As I showed you with speak, you can see all of these forms and all the arguments from the ontology, but I'm summarizing them here. Ask D is to ask someone about something. The people asked Jesus about the law. Ask E is to ask someone a direct question. So we haven't had that form yet. So this is a quote. Jesus asked the people that followed Jesus, left bracket, open quote, people say, left bracket, that I, Jesus, paren, am which person? Close bracket. Okay, now there's a difference here that's good to note. If this direct speech had a period, the period would go at the end of the sentence. Maybe there should be a period there also. I'm not sure about that. I should check that. There might be supposed to be a period here at the end. I'd have to put it in the analyzer and see what happens. But at any rate, the question goes inside the quote. Question mark goes inside the quote, not at the end. So, and that's kind of logical that the period, if there is one, always marks the end of the sentence that Jesus asked something, whereas the question mark is part of the quote. So this is just like direct speech, except for this where the question mark goes. Finally, there's ask F, which is to ask someone a question indirectly. John asked Mary, left bracket, if Mary was happy. Then there are forms for answer. Answer A is just like say A for direct speech. So say A could be used to show that someone answers a question, but to be more specific, you can use the word answer. Answer B is to answer a prayer. God answered that prayer. Answer C is to answer a question. Jesus answered that question. Now, I haven't shown you every example of the verbs that express communication. There's admit, when someone admits that he did something wrong. Confess. Right now we have this as a word that you can use in general, but in my opinion, confess ought to be always paired as a complex concept with admit. There's describe, think, and write. Think and write have senses that are very similar to say. You can have direct speech, someone thought, and then in quotes, something that was directly thought or written, or you could have something that was indirectly thought or written. Okay, so that's a review, a discussion of the verb forms that we use for expressing communication and the syntax that we have to use that helps the analyzer to do a better job.